Having declared the custom of annual communion an invention of the devil, by whose instrumentality soever introduced, he goes on to vindicate Zephyrinus from the charge, since under the frequent dispensation of the Ordinance in his age it seldom happened that all did communicate, and since it was necessary that those who had a right to do so, being mixed with idolatrous and the profane, should in some public way testify their faith, this holy man appointed a set day when the whole Christian people might make confession of their faith in partaking of the supper. This appointment of Zephyrinus, otherwise good, posterity perverted, establishing a law by which annual communicating was made the minimum of solemn service. Here Calvin, in apologizing for Zephyrinus, remarks the disadvantage of weekly dispensation. He allows it was found to cherish a spirit of indifference about communicating. Even all the members of the same congregation did not join in celebrating the feast. He expressly approves the Zephyrine decree, by which set times were appointed when the ordinance might be observed, after the due order, and seems to have considered it as a piece of reformation in that age. That Calvin should befriend weekly communion may appear surprising to some, while his opinion may be sufficient to determine the minds of others. But the zeal of the first reformers against the superstitions of popery might carry them too far on some points. Fleeing from one extreme, they were apt to fall into the other, ere the consequences could appear to correct them. Thus a just indignation at the intolerable yoke of fasts and festivals, days dedicated to saints, to events, etc., in the Romish Church, seems to have driven Calvin off his guard, even with respect to the Sabbath. He maintains by far too spiritual views of the seventh part of our time claimed by God, and speaks dubiously of the moral obligation of the fourth commandment in regard to the suspension of labor. On this head, too, he could appeal to the practice of primitive times. The Christians, the more effectually to distinguish themselves from the Jews, did not incline to observe the first day of the week after the mode of the Jewish Sabbath. They were apt to go to an extreme from aversion to the Mosaic system. And why might not Calvin go to an extreme, as on the doctrine of the Sabbath, so on that of communion, from a just hatred of the Romish system, founded on a clear perception of the mystery of iniquity it involved? To this very principle the origin of the independent scheme may be traced. What was it at first but an extreme, into which some good men were carried by their aversion to episcopacy and the Romish hierarchy? We condemn those who, while they leveled at the anti-Christian fabric, demolished Christianity itself and became a nation of deists. And surely we may discard the artificial devotion, disclaim, and the example, traditions, and enactions of apostate Rome may make a sufficient remove from all her superstitions, though we do not hurry into enthusiasm, nor establish counter-schemes and regulations as really inimical to the institutions and order of the house of God. That Calvin and others should have fixed upon the Presbyterian plan of government and order as that appointed by Jesus, while so many circumstances combined to carry them into the opposite extreme from Romish domination, and that plan should have had such a general reception among the Reformed, while the same circumstances, strengthened by the new temptations to deviate either to the right or the left, existed, must have been owing to the serious meditation on the divine rule, and an accurate investigation of the mind of Jesus. They were thus, through the good hand of God upon them, taught where to stop, and prevented from tarnishing the glory of their victorious career. We may rather wonder that the instances should be so few in which they missed the spirit of Presbyterianism, than that any occur. The words of Calvin, of which such advantage has been taken, are in fact a lamentation over the dismal state of religion under the reign of Antichrist, and the deplorable lukewarmness pronounced by the inactions of Rome. Deplorable lukewarmness produced by the inactions of Rome. The decree of the Council of Lateran had sanctioned annual communicating, whence it came to pass, says he, that almost all, when they had once observed the ordinance, as if they had discharged their duty for the year, gave themselves no farther concern about the memorial of our Lord's death. It ought to have been far otherwise. Every week, at least, the tables should have been covered for the Christian assemblies. And who would not prefer even an over-attention to the supper to an impious neglect? Who would not rather see a weekly dispensation of that divine institution than have the service of the church engrossed and debased by a pompous routine of human festivals and superstitious observances? In the first case, there would at least be the appearance of some fervor of piety and of zeal for the honor of Jesus, such as is thought to have prevailed in primitive times, when even daily communions were sought. Spiritual advantage might also have been expected, though all the ends of the ordinance had not been fulfilled. In the other case, what but the honor of saints and martyrs, real or fictitious, seemed to be regarded? How could the blessing of the Lord be expected or desired to a ritual every way hostile to his will, and by which his ordinances were thrown into the shade? Under it the spirit of pure religion behooved to languish and expire. But Calvin expressed his decided opinion. Every week, at least, the table should have been covered. Yes, and it was natural, on contemplating the scenes of corruption and irreligion before him, to give this decision. The soul is apt to be transported on such occasions beyond the bounds which a farther attention to the sacred oracles and a correcting experience would set. Did Calvin ever attempt to establish weekly communion? He was, it is likely, prevented by what he allows in defending Zephyrinus. That it was found to cherish a spirit of indifference as really as the Lateran edict, though not in an equal degree. He saw probably that were it established, even in that reforming age, which was certainly not defective in zeal and genuine religion, another Zephyrine law would soon become needful. Only 4 times a year was the supper observed at Geneva, and in most of the Reformed churches Calvin himself expresses the same fears with Witzius and other great men who lived afterwards, that a more frequent dispensation might deprecate the ordinance. For there is another passage in his writings which ought to be known, one where he coolly delivers his mind, and when treating directly of church observances, to celebrate the supper once every month would indeed be more agreeable to me, provided more frequent dispensation did not produce negligence. And here a footnote. These words of Calvin are quoted by Bingham. He states that the supper was dispensed only 4 times a year among the Reformed, but thus gives his mind. And here a large Latin phrase. However strange it may appear, what is styled by the advocates of weekly observance in frequent communion has ever on the reflection been considered as upon the whole most favorable even to the interests of religion. The very men who, in some fervor of zeal, have declaimed against it under this title, ambiguous and calculated to mislead, have in cooler moments either partially or wholly come over to its side. A monthly observance was what his judgment approved, but he was afraid a more frequent dispensation might overshoot the mark and defeat the very design in view. Since the independent scheme has been developed and displayed its operation, the Reformed have been led to mark other reasons against weekly communion, which do not seem to have occurred to Calvin. Reasons connected with the very nature of the ordinance and its manifest design in regard to the visible church. Section 5. Observance of fast, thanksgiving, and preparation days. Among Presbyterians, the observance of certain days is usually connected with the dispensation of the supper. This practice has of late been traduced as an unwarrantable human invention, an unrighteous yoke of bondage, nay, represented as hostile to the commandment of Jesus and a manifest reversion to Judaism. The days referred to have never been considered as essential to the right celebration of the ordinance. They who befriend them, and among whom they obtain, are not in the habit of condemning others as guilty of profaning the supper by holding it without them. Nor are they ignorant of the fact that for many ages this sacrament was observed without any regular attentions to public preparatory service. The law has not yet been made to establish, even by church authority, the necessity of fast, preparation, and thanksgiving days, or to wed these to the supper, as a late author has expressed it. Acts for uniformity may have been framed, but they were never designed to mark out any particular mode as what ought always to be observed. The propriety and necessity of a general attention to uniformity was what they enjoined. In other respects, they were merely recommendatory, and as such, the spirit only of these acts has been honored in the Presbyterian churches of Scotland. The specific appointment of the days under consideration has always rested with sessions, and the authority of the appointment has not been extended beyond the proper sphere. To subject the members of other congregations to exclusion from the ordinance for not having joined with their brethren in all the preparatory exercises.